The correction came quietly, the way Vivian's corrections always did, shaped to carry across a room without technically raising its volume. "The Beaumont party," Vivian said, arriving at James's left shoulder as though she had materialized there, "is under Beaumont. The X is silent. I would have expected 3 years to be sufficient time to acquire that." She did not lower her voice. The 4 guests arranged in the lobby's sitting area, the ones who had arrived 20 minutes early for their dinner reservation, had nothing else to look at. 2 of them found reasons to inspect their phones. 1 did not bother. James looked down at the booking screen. The name was spelled the same way it had been the hour before and the hour before that. She said, "I'll make a note of it." And she did. A small line in her own handwriting at the top of the printed card, the phonetic spelling in neat characters, an anchor for later in the shift. Vivian moved toward the bar entrance, pausing once to exchange a word with a guest whose name she knew, and the moment closed like water over a stone. James set the card in its slot. She straightened the pen cup that did not need straightening. She looked at the lobby entrance, at the brushed gold handles on the glass doors, at the early evening light coming through them from the street. 3 years. She had been standing at some version of this desk for 3 years. The Hartfield was not a large hotel. 26 rooms across 4 floors, a restaurant that seated 40 on a good night, a bar that the concierge staff kept supplied with the correct periodicals and the correct temperature of air. It was the kind of place where every decision about the linens had been made by someone with a strong opinion about thread count. The kind of place that measured its own excellence by whether guests could tell how much effort had gone into making the effort invisible. James had understood that from her first week. She understood now, 3 years later, that Vivian understood it differently. For Vivian, the invisible effort was reserved for the guests worth the invisibility. For James, it had never occurred to her to apply it any other way. Ruth came around the edge of the reservations alcove at 6:30, carrying a printout she had already reviewed and did not need to review again. "The Beaumont party," Ruth said, not looking up. "Beaumont," James said. "The X is silent." Ruth looked up then. Her expression was dry and entirely fond. "I'll alert the engravers." She set the printout on the edge of the desk and went back to her alcove, and James felt the small warmth of it, the warmth of someone who made a joke to say that they had witnessed something without making a production of the witnessing. Ruth had worked the reservations desk for 7 years. She had watched 3 front-of-house directors come and occupy that particular posture, and she carried that knowledge the way certain people carry age, lightly, without announcing it. The evening settled into its rhythm. James confirmed a taxi for room 7, sourced a restaurant recommendation for room 12, and handled the small mechanical business of a shift that was organized precisely so that she would handle the mechanical business of a shift. Vivian had restructured the desk assignments 4 months earlier, moving James to the secondary position that managed logistics, while the primary position, which was where a young man named Pryor worked, managed client interaction. Pryor was 24 and had perfect teeth and called guests by their first names in a way that felt practiced rather than warm, and the guests did not seem to notice the difference. James did not say this to anyone. She was 31 years old and had learned the specific skill of knowing a thing clearly and choosing where to put it. At 7:15, the doors opened and a man came in off the street. He was carrying a coat over one arm, a dark wool coat that looked like it had been expensive once and had since been used as a coat rather than maintained as a garment. He was wearing a plain sweater, grey, over dark trousers, and he had the kind of stillness in his movement that did not read as hesitation. He stopped just inside the doors, looked at the lobby with the attentiveness of someone cataloguing rather than admiring, and then came toward the desk. Pryor was with a guest at the far end of the counter. James stepped into position. "Good evening," she said. "Are you checking in?" "I don't have a reservation," he said. His voice was even, not apologetic, simply stating a fact. "I was hoping you might have something available." James turned to the system. The hotel had 3 rooms vacant that night, which was not unusual for a Tuesday in the second week of October. She confirmed the availability for the smaller suite on the 3rd floor, the rate, the inclusions. The man listened without appearing to calculate. "That works," he said. She took his card, processed the payment, created the profile. She asked his name. "Declan Marsh," he said. "The first name is Declan, if you want to put the phonetic in the notes." She typed it in. She printed the keycard sleeve, wrote his name on it in her small, careful handwriting, and passed it across the desk. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Room 314. The elevator is to your left, and the restaurant closes at 10, but the bar stays open until midnight. If you need anything during your stay, the desk is staffed until 11. He took the sleeve with the key card inside it. He looked at her name tag, then at her. He said, "Thank you, James." It was the way he said it that she noticed, and she noticed that she noticed. Not James with the second syllable made into an afterthought, the way people sometimes turn the name into something smaller than its 2 letters. He said it with the same quality of attention he had given the rest of his words, as though saying someone's name was a thing worth doing correctly. He went to the elevator. James looked at the booking screen for a moment before entering the next line of notes. 3 days after his arrival, Vivian called James into the small office behind the coat room to discuss, as Vivian put it, the allocation of James's considerable skill set. The office had a desk that was too large for the room and a chair that was marginally too small for the desk, and Vivian sat behind it in a way that communicated she found both facts appropriate. She had a printed document in front of her that she did not look at during the conversation, which meant it was a prop. "The role I'm envisioning," Vivian said, "is really more of a coordination position. The back-of-house communication pipeline has been inconsistent, and someone with your organizational instincts would be a natural fit. It would free the client-facing team to focus on the guest experience where it's most visible." James looked at her. "You're moving me to back-of-house." "I'm offering you an expanded scope," Vivian said. "I'd think of it as a broadening." "When would this take effect?" "We'd transition after the weekend," James said. "I'd like to think about it." Vivian's expression moved in a way that communicated she had expected this, and found it predictable. "Of course," she said. "Let's plan to finalize on Friday." She looked down at the document that she had not been using, and James took that as her cue to leave. She walked back through the coat room, past the row of black umbrella hooks and the numbered wooden pegs, through the door into the lobby corridor. She was 3 steps into the corridor before she understood that she had not been offered a choice. The phrasing had been collaborative, the timeline had been specific, and the outcome had already been decided. Friday was when they would confirm what Vivian had already arranged. She stood in the corridor for a moment, one hand on the wall, looking at the far end where the lobby light came through. Ruth was passing with a stack of folded correspondence when James came back to the desk. Ruth looked at her once, did not ask, and set the correspondence in its tray with the particular care of someone making time. "She's moving me to coordination," James said quietly. Ruth set down the last envelope. She straightened it to align with the others. "Back of house," she said. She called it expanded scope. She called the last woman's demotion a portfolio refocus. Ruth did not look up. That woman filed a transfer request the same week. James looked at the lobby. The evening guests were beginning to arrive. A woman in a red coat was asking Pryor something, and Pryor was smiling with all his teeth and gesturing toward the restaurant. "I don't want to transfer," James said. "No," Ruth said. "I didn't think you did." That evening, Declan came back to the desk. He arrived at the 7:45 lull, the pocket of time between the dinner rush and the later guests, when the lobby was quiet enough that footsteps were audible across the marble. He came from the elevator and stopped at the desk's near edge, not urgently in the way of a man who had decided to be somewhere and had arrived there. "I had a question about the area," he said. "I was told there's a market on Wednesdays, but I can't find a reference online." "There is," James said. "It's on Greystone Street, not the main market square, so it doesn't come up easily. It runs from 8 in the morning until about 2. She wrote the street name on a card, added the cross street and the hours, and passed it across. He looked at the card. "Thank you," he said, and did not move immediately, which she registered without knowing what to do with the registration. "Is there anything else?" she asked. He looked at her, and the quality of the look was the thing she had noticed the first night, that particular attentiveness that was not performance and not habit, but something that came from behind the eyes. "Not tonight," he said. He came back the following evening, and the one after that. On the second evening he asked about the transit routes. On the third he asked nothing at all, arriving at the desk during the same quiet interval and standing at the near edge for a moment while James finished entering a note. And when she looked up, he said, "I walked past the market this afternoon. The cheese vendor recognized a regular from 2 streets away and held a piece of paper-wrapped something under the counter for her without being asked." He paused. "I thought you'd want to know your recommendation held up." James considered this. "The market or the cheese vendor?" "The vendor specifically." "That's good to know," she said. "I'll update my notes." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. The particular version of almost that keeps its distance from performance. On the fourth evening, which was the Thursday before Vivian had scheduled the Friday finalization meeting, James was not at the desk. She was in the corridor behind the coat room, returning a guest's garment bag that had been sent to the wrong hook, moving quickly because the shift was fully staffed, and she had no particular reason to be doing this task, except that she had noticed it needed doing, and the person who usually caught such things was occupied. She was passing the office door when she heard it. Vivian's voice through the partially open door, measured and conversational. The way Vivian sounded when she was speaking to someone she was already certain agreed with her. "She's perfectly capable of logistics. She's organized, she's reliable, she shows up. But there's an instinct this kind of client requires, a certain orientation toward the guest's experience, and James doesn't have it. I've watched her for 3 years, and the ceiling is exactly where I've placed it. The back-of-house move is the right position. She'll be more comfortable there." A pause. A voice James did not know responded, something low and brief. "I've already spoken to her about it," Vivian said. "Friday we finalize." James stood outside the door for the space of 4 complete seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way the body keeps track of things the mind is trying not to process. She walked to the coat room. She hung the garment bag on the correct hook. She stood at the umbrella rack with both hands at her sides and looked at the numbered wooden pegs until they stopped being an image of anything and were just pegs. The instinct this kind of client requires. She had been walking into this building for 3 years. She had learned the phonetic pronunciation of 43 surnames by her own count. She had sourced during a single October evening the previous year a replacement birthday cake for a guest whose dietary restrictions the kitchen had misread, a task that required 4 phone calls and a taxi fare she had advanced from her own wallet and recovered from petty cash the following morning. She had done these things not because she expected them to be seen, but because they were in front of her, and she was there, and she could do them. The instinct this kind of client requires. She had no name for what she was feeling that was both accurate and small enough to carry through the rest of a shift. She found one, eventually. She called it tired because tired was true even if it was not all of the truth, and she went back to the desk. Ruth did not ask. James did not say. They worked the rest of the shift in the companionable quiet of people who have spent enough time in the same small geography to have developed a language of posture. At 10:45, when the desk traffic slowed to nothing, Ruth set her last printout in its tray and said, without looking up, whatever she said in that office, she was talking to hear herself talk. James straightened the pen cup. She said it to someone else. Same thing, Ruth said. She's been saying that version of it to someone else for as long as she's had an audience. James looked at the entrance doors, the brushed gold handles, the evening light long gone now, the street outside amber and dark. She's moving me Friday, James said. I know, Ruth said. I'm not going to transfer. I know that too, Ruth said. On Friday morning, before the finalization meeting, Declan came to the desk earlier than his usual interval. The lobby had not yet reached its daytime volume, and James was alone at the primary position, Prior not due for another 40 minutes. She looked up when she heard the elevator, and he came across the marble with the wool coat already over his arm, the movement of a man who had been thinking about something and had decided to come down. I'm checking out in an hour, he said. James noted the time mentally, his 5th day. She moved to pull his account on the system. Was everything all right with the room? She asked. Standard? Automatic? Yes, he said. Then, after a moment, the desk staff was particularly good. I'll pass that along, she said. He was quiet for a moment while she reviewed the folio. The folio was clean. He had ordered room service twice, charged one item to the bar, and left the room in the state of a person who treats temporary things with care. I wanted to ask you something, he said. She looked up. Your name tag says James. Is that your first name or your surname? She had been asked this before, usually with a specific flavor of polite skepticism, the question doing slightly different work than its words suggested. She said, first name. He looked at the tag, then at her, with that quality of attention she had now seen enough times to stop being surprised by. What's your surname? He asked. She almost said something shortened, something that would fit neatly into the brief exchange and not require anyone to work at it. She had said the shortened version so many times, it had worn its own groove. She could feel the groove from the inside. She said, Agyemang. She gave it the full 4 syllables, the weight on the second, the way her father had said it and his mother before him, the version she had stopped offering to people who did not ask, with enough attention to be worth offering it to. Declan repeated it back. He said it the same way she had said it, unhurried, the syllables given their full measure. Not a performance of effort, not the theatrical, careful pronunciation that was its own kind of condescension. He said it simply and correctly, as though he had simply heard it and repeated what he heard. James looked at him. It's a good name, he said. It sounds like something people should bother to say correctly. She did not know what to say to that, which was not a common experience for her. She said, thank you, and heard how small those 2 words were, relative to whatever they were trying to carry. He nodded once. I'll be back down in an hour, he said, and went back to the elevator. James stood at the desk for a moment after the elevator doors closed. The lobby was quiet. The pen cup sat to her left. The morning light came through the brass-handled doors, at an angle that made the marble look like it was generating its own warmth from somewhere below the surface. She went into the finalization meeting with Vivian at 9 o'clock. Vivian had the paperwork ready. The transition was described as a structural adjustment, the new position outlined in 2 short paragraphs that mentioned efficiency and operational support and said nothing about clients. James read the 2 paragraphs. She set the paper on the edge of the desk. "I'd like my current role to remain client-facing," she said. Vivian's expression performed patience. "As I mentioned earlier in the week, the restructuring is based on where the team's strengths are best utilized." "You said I don't have the instinct for this kind of clientele," James said. A very small shift occurred in Vivian's expression, the kind of shift that happens when a word lands in a room it was not intended to enter. "I said that your strengths are organizational," Vivian said. "There's no criticism in that." "I'm aware you didn't intend it as criticism," James said. "I'm saying it's not accurate." Vivian looked at the paperwork. "The decision has been made, James." "Then I'd like a week to consider my options." She said her own name the way she had said her surname 20 minutes earlier at the desk, not performing anything, simply claiming the territory the name occupied. "That's a reasonable request." Vivian looked at her for a moment. "1 week," she said, in the tone of a person making a concession that changes nothing. The lobby was busier when she came back out. Pryor was at the primary desk and had arranged his smile for a pair of guests who were in the process of being delighted by it. Ruth was at the reservations alcove, talking someone through a date adjustment on the phone, her pen moving in small figures on a notepad while she listened. James went to the secondary desk position. She opened the logbook. She wrote in the top line for the morning, "Guest preferences, notes on the Beaumont party checkout for the evening," a reminder about the Wednesday market card she had given to a guest in room 2 who had asked about local shopping. She wrote Agyamang in the top margin of the page, not for any logistical reason, simply because it was her name and the pen was in her hand. At 10:15, Declan came down from the elevator with his bag, the wool coat over his arm, a second bag she had not seen before, small and flat, that he carried in his other hand. He crossed the lobby to the desk, and James handled his checkout, reviewed the folio with him, and printed the receipt. He signed the folio with a signature that was legible, which she noted as she filed it, because legible signatures were unusual enough to qualify as a characteristic. While she was printing the confirmation, she said, "I hope the rest of your travel goes well." He folded the confirmation once and put it in his coat pocket. He looked at her for a moment, the same attentiveness, and she had the feeling she had had each evening at the desk, that the attentiveness was not simply politeness, that it was something that came from behind the politeness and was doing a different kind of work. "Ms. Agyamang," he said. He said her full name, the one she had given him that morning. "Thank you for your help this week," he said. "All of it," she said. "Come back to visit." It was a standard farewell. She had said it to hundreds of guests. It sounded different in her own ears this time, but she set the difference in the drawer with the other things she was not analyzing, and went back to the logbook. He went out through the brass-handled doors, and the morning light took him. At 10:20, his colleague arrived. She knew him as the colleague because she did not know him otherwise. A man in a suit with the particular efficiency of movement that belongs to people who run on tight schedules and know it. He came through the doors without pausing, looked at the lobby with the same cataloguing attentiveness Declan had shown on his first evening, and then looked toward the desk. He was not looking at James. He was looking at the lobby entrance behind her, and then he was looking past the desk, toward the door at the back of the lobby that led to the corridor, and then he was looking at the elevator. And then Declan came back through the entrance doors behind him, because he had apparently not yet left, and the man in the suit turned and said, very clearly into the quiet of the mostly empty morning lobby, "Marsh, I have the car outside. Hendricks needs you on the call for the Whitmore acquisition before we get to the site. They've been holding 15 minutes. He said one other thing. He said it naturally and without any sense that it carried weight for anyone else in the room. He said, The team has been wondering all week why the CEO is doing a solo walk of this property instead of sending the review team, but the preliminary assessment is already on your phone if you want it before we leave. Pryor stopped mid-sentence with his guest. Vivian, who had come into the lobby from the corridor 2 minutes earlier and was positioned near the seating area in conversation with the guests who had checked in at 9, the same 4-seat grouping from the same arrangement she had occupied when she corrected James on the Beaumont name, stopped speaking. The room produced a stillness that was not its usual morning quiet. It was a specific kind of stillness, the kind produced when information arrives in a room that reorganizes everything already present. Declan looked at his colleague with the expression of a man who has spent a week managing the pace of a specific piece of information and has just watched it leave his hands. He said, "Griffin." One word. Level. Griffin, whose name James now had, looked back with the mild expression of a man who does not yet understand what he has done. Vivian's head turned toward the desk, toward James specifically, in the way one looks at a problem that has just changed shape. James did not look at Vivian. She was looking at Declan, who had crossed back into the lobby and was now standing in the open space between the entrance and the desk, with the wool coat over his arm, not performing anything, simply present in the room with whatever he was. She understood, standing there, what she had witnessed over the course of a week, the attentiveness that she had registered as unusual but had not named, the questions that were not quite questions, the way he had moved through the lobby each evening as though learning it, the way he had eaten in the restaurant once and asked no one about the food but had sat very still and listened to everything around him. The card with the market directions that she had written out and that he had folded and kept, not because he needed the market, but because he had wanted to know who she was when she thought she was simply being helpful. She had not known she was taking a test. She had been taking it for 5 days. Declan looked at her. He said across the space between them, "James." She looked at him. "Your instinct," he said, "for this kind of property is the reason I'm standing here on a Friday morning instead of reading a review team's report." He did not say this for the room. He said it to her. The room heard it anyway. Vivian's posture changed in a way that was entirely visible and entirely involuntary. The specific realignment that occurs when a social surface that has been held under deliberate tension is suddenly released from the direction that was doing the holding. She looked from James to Declan and back to James, and the look had none of the particular authority it usually carried. "Mr. Marsh," she said, starting across the lobby toward him. "I had no idea you were the party conducting the property review. We would have arranged for a proper introduction at the management level. The Hartfield is obviously committed to any acquisition review process, and we can make any resources available that would assist the assessment." Declan looked at her with the same quality of attention he gave everything, patient and entirely clear. "I've been assisted," he said. "Thank you." Griffin was already pulling out his phone. Declan said something brief and low to him. Griffin nodded and stepped outside, and then Declan turned back to the lobby. He walked to the desk. Not the primary desk where Pryor stood with his guests, who were now very carefully not watching. The secondary desk, where James was. He set the flat bag he had been carrying on the desk surface between them. He said, "This is the preliminary assessment from the review team. It includes their feedback on desk operations specifically, which I'll need to review with whoever is managing that function after the acquisition." A pause. "I'd expect that to be someone with organizational instincts and a demonstrated ability to make clients feel seen. In my experience, those two qualities don't usually appear in the same person." James looked at the bag. She looked at him. "You're acquiring the hotel," she said. "We're in the process," he said. Ruth made a sound at the reservations alcove that was not quite words and was entirely Ruth. James looked at the bag for another moment. She said, When would the acquisition finalize? 30 to 60 days, depending on the due diligence process. He looked at her steadily. The desk operations review will be part of that. I see, she said. He reached across and tapped the bag once with 2 fingers, the lightest indication that it was meant to stay where it was. I'll send the formal communication through the appropriate channels, he said, but I wanted to leave this here first. She nodded. He picked up the coat from where he had set it on the desk edge during the exchange. He looked at her once more. Ms. Agyemang, he said. He said it correctly, unhurried, every syllable given its full measure, the way she had said it to him that morning, and he had repeated it back. He went to the door. Griffin was visible through the glass, on his phone, gesturing. Declan pushed through the brass handles, and the late morning light received him, and he was gone. The room sorted itself back into motion the way a room does, gradually, with the slight self-consciousness of people who have been watching something and are now returning to the performance of not having watched. Pryor's guests went to the restaurant. Pryor moved papers on the primary desk without apparent purpose. Ruth picked up her pen and looked at the notepad in front of her and wrote nothing on it. Vivian stood near the seating area. She had not completed her crossing of the lobby. She stood where she had stopped, and her posture held the particular quality of someone recalculating a series of decisions that have already been made and cannot be unmade, and discovering that the recalculation does not improve any of the outcomes. She looked at James. James looked back at her from the secondary desk, and the secondary desk was simply the desk she was standing at, and the lobby was simply the room they were both in, and the flat bag with the preliminary assessment was sitting on the surface to her left, and none of it required any comment from either of them. Vivian looked away first. Ruth appeared at the edge of the secondary desk 3 minutes later with a cup of coffee she had collected from the staff room, which she set on the desk surface without ceremony. That was, Ruth said, then paused, then completed the sentence, a thing that happened. James put both hands around the cup. It was, she said. I'm going to require you to tell me everything, Ruth said, including the part where you clearly knew something and said nothing. I didn't know anything, James said. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was deeply skeptical and entirely warm. You wrote your full name in the logbook margin at 8:45 this morning, she said. You've never done that before, not in 7 years of me watching you not do it. James looked at the logbook. She looked at the cup of coffee. She looked at the lobby, at the marble floor with the morning light coming through the entrance doors at an angle that was already shifting as the sun moved, that would be different in an hour, that would be the low amber warmth of the evening by the time the next shift began. I was just filling in the margin, she said. Of course you were, Ruth said. The Friday shift continued. Guests arrived and departed. The Beaumont party, Beaumont with the silent X, checked out at noon, and the guest who had looked at his phone during Vivian's correction tipped generously and said the service had been exceptional. James noted it in the log. Pryor handled the lunch hour at the primary desk with his practiced efficiency, and nobody assigned James to an overflow task, and nobody suggested she step back from the lobby. Vivian moved through the afternoon with a quality of careful attention that was new in its register, the attention of someone who has learned that a room contains more than they have been mapping. At 4 o'clock, a formal email arrived in the hotel management system. It was from a company called Marsh Group Hospitality. The subject line read, Acquisition Process Formal Notice and Staff Consultation. James saw it flagged in the secondary desk terminal because she was the one at the terminal when it came in, and she opened it and read the first paragraph, which confirmed the formal commencement of the acquisition review and listed the key contacts on the acquiring team, and noted that all existing staff would be invited to a consultation process to ensure continuity of service quality. At the bottom of the email, under the standard legal footer, there was a handwritten addendum that had been photographed and attached. It said, "The desk operation is already assessed, well above standard. No changes recommended." The handwriting was the same quality as the signature on the folio. Legible, deliberate. James printed the email. She held it in both hands for a moment. She filed it in the operations binder under correspondence, current, and went back to the terminal. The shift ended at 7. The evening team arrived, 2 young women who moved with the brisk energy of people whose shift was just beginning. And James walked them through the day's log and noted the pending dinner reservation for the party in room 11, and confirmed that the market card supply in the concierge drawer was running low and should be restocked. She said the market was on Greystone Street. One of the young women wrote it down. Ruth was already in her coat at the alcove, packing her bag with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had perfected the end-of-day departure over 7 years. She looked at James. She said, "Monday?" "Monday," James said. James put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked to the edge of the desk and stood for a moment, the way she sometimes did at the end of a shift, not in the posture of lingering or sentiment, but in the simple way of someone making sure they have left a space in the correct order before they leave it. The pen cup was straight. The logbook was closed. The operations binder with its filed correspondence sat square in its place, on the shelf under the terminal. She looked at the lobby, the marble floor with the early evening light coming through the entrance doors, not the bright morning angle and not yet the low amber warmth of later, but something between them, a particular quality of late afternoon gold that lit the room from the side and made the whole space look as though it had paused. She had stood at this desk for 3 years. She had said names, copied names, learned the correct weight of syllables in 43 surnames she had looked up so that she would not get them wrong, so that the person on the other side of the desk would hear their own name said back to them with the same care they had put into it themselves. She had done this not because anyone was watching, not because it was in the manual, or because Vivian had suggested it, but because it was in front of her, and she was there, and it seemed like the obvious thing, the only thing that made sense when you were holding someone's name in your hands. She had not known that constituted an instinct. She crossed the lobby. The evening team was settling into position, the young women moving through the small, familiar choreography of the start of a shift. Ruth came through from the alcove and joined her at the entrance. They went out through the brass-handled doors together. The street was cool and amber-lit and full of people moving in the direction of wherever they were going next. James walked 1 block before she stopped at the corner and stood with her bag and looked at the street. She thought about a coat folded over an arm and the way a name sounds when someone says it without calculating whether it is worth the effort. Ruth appeared beside her. "You're standing on the corner," Ruth observed. "I know," James said. "Any particular reason?" James thought about it. "Someone said my name correctly this week," she said. "I think I'd forgotten what that felt like." Ruth was quiet for a moment. A taxi went past. The amber light shifted. "Agyemang," Ruth said carefully, working through the syllables with the determination of someone who has just decided this matters. James looked at her. "How was that?" Ruth asked. "Perfect," James said. She said it the way she had said her surname that morning at the desk, giving it its full weight. All 4 syllables, the emphasis where it belonged, and Ruth said it back again with the confidence of someone who has heard a thing correctly and intends to carry it. They walked down the street together in the cooling evening, and behind them the hotel sat in its warm gold light with its brass-handled doors. And the concierge desk inside it was occupied by the evening team, and the logbook on the shelf had James Agyemang written in the margin of Friday's page in small, careful handwriting. Not for any operational purpose, simply because the name was there, and the pen had been in her hand, and it had seemed, for reasons she could not have explained before that morning, like exactly the right thing to put down.